Take it away.
Well, welcome. Welcome on behalf of the New Haven Free Public Library. This is Books Sandwiched In. Today we have Nadia Owusu. Welcome, Nadia. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
She's the author of Aftershocks. It's her memoir detailing growing up in various countries, also dealing with abandonment by a parent and with grief. Um, it's a pleasure to have you, and we're looking forward to your reading and to answering our questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Would you like to begin by doing a reading?
Sure, I'm happy to do that.
Okay.
I'll just read a short section. It's called Failures of Language. I do not have my great-grandfather's worn but carefully pressed cotton handkerchief. My father's family aren't much for holding on to material things. I do not have my maternal great-grandmother's red hair or my paternal grandfather's coffee bean skin. What an unusual combination, people often say when I describe my parentage, Ghanaian, Armenian, and more than once, how did that even happen? I speak 3.5 languages that do not belong to me, that do not run through my veins. English, Italian, and French, decent Swahili. When my relatives and country people maneuver between English and their home languages, Tree, Armenian, and Turkish, I grip the ropes of the English words as firmly as my jittery hands will allow and loop them into knots. I watch for cocked eyebrows and pursed lips to translate the rest. The warm, round percussion of Tree and the orderly harmony of Turkish, which spoken by my family, is diluted with a splash of archaic Armenian and a heavy pour of Boston accent, are familiar but impenetrable. I can spot members of my two disparate tribes in a crowd, but I cannot address them except in basic greeting and pleasantry. Good morning, how are you? Welcome. In Tree, I can also say even the elephant can swat flies with its short tail, and any river loses its identity when entering the sea. My father, when his intention was to remind or chastise, was fond of proverbs and folk tales. The heroes of those tales were animals of the forest, spirits, and gods. I know them by name. My Ghanaian relatives are at times tickled by my inability to speak Tree. At other times they are affronted. How can you not speak your own language, they ask, not acknowledging that my learning it would have required them to teach me. Once, when I was in the market with an auntie, I cannot remember which one, a woman asked why no one had taught me to speak my father tongue. Nobody wants to hear her speaking Tree in an American accent, the auntie replied. Since she replied in English, I can only assume she meant for me to understand. In Tree, I cannot say, love me, accept me. At 13, I could not ask my father not to die. In Turkish, I know the words for eggplant, yogurt, and savory pastries. The stories of my mother's family are very much concerned with food. What was served, whose dish was tastiest, and delicious gossip, who messed up the baklava. As a child, when I visited them in Massachusetts, we talked about eggplant, losh kebab, and pilaf with little chopped up noodles in it. We planned for dinner as we washed lunch dishes. We ate to remember those who escaped genocide and nearly starved in the desert, to honor what they made possible for us. My grandmother taught me to roll rice and lamb into grape leaves. My mother read to me from 1001 Nights. Ali Baba said, "Open sesame," and discovered a stolen treasure. A genie emerged from a lamp to do Aladdin's bidding. Scheherazade told tales to a king to delay her own execution. Another one, I said to my mother after each story. Tell me another one. I do not know the Turkish word for stay. At 7, I could not say, Mama, come back. In Armenian, the language largely lost to my mother's family generations ago at the hands of the Ottoman Empire, the only word I know is the word for underwear, vardig. This knowledge I cannot explain. When I encounter strangers from my tribes, they are startled by my attempts to communicate. They do not recognize me as one of their own. They laugh, charmed, and perhaps a little disturbed by the discrepancy between appearance and sound. When I explain myself, they think me a curious hybrid. They speak to me, always, in English. I'll stop there.
That's beautiful.
That was beautiful.
Thank you.
So Nadia, I'm glad you picked that excerpt, because I actually had a question about that. So there are a couple of sentences in there that really struck me when I read the book. Like, I speak 3.5 languages that do not belong to me, and any river loses its identity when it goes into the sea. So I noticed identity, home, and belonging in particular seem to be major, like, reoccurring themes throughout the book. And you wrote about both your experiences being raised all over the world and how there's a heritage of your Armenian mother and a Ghanaian father. Many times you described your many homes, but you didn't feel like you belonged there. How did the concepts of home, identity, and belonging all connect for you, especially in terms of the book?
Sure. Just to share a little bit about my story for those who haven't read the book. So, my Armenian American mother left when I was 2, and my sister and I were raised by our father, who was from Ghana, who was the great hero of my life, and he worked for a UN agency. So we moved to a different country every couple of years. And when I was 7 and we were living in Rome, after a long absence, my mother showed up at our house on the same day that I learned about a catastrophic earthquake that destroyed the city of Spitak in Armenia. And we heard this on the radio. My father always listened to the BBC World Service in the morning. And I remember the voice on the radio talking about the possibility of aftershocks. And I asked my father what aftershocks are. And he said, they're the tremors that follow an earthquake. They're the Earth's delayed reaction to stress. And then later that day, my mother showed up and she took my sister and me to lunch, and we walked around Piazza Navona in Rome. And then that evening, she dropped us back at our house and was gone again. And I think because my mother is Armenian American and because my father kind of generally avoided the topic of my mother, because I think he was also hurt by her leaving the family, I felt like I wasn't supposed to talk about her. And that was sort of one element of my identity that I wasn't deeply connected to, even though it's half of my DNA. And in some ways, the earthquake and my personal shaking and having my mother show up and leave so quickly kind of combined and conflated in me, and I sort of became obsessed with earthquakes and specifically the ways we predict and measure disaster. And this obsession kind of fermented as I got older and became a way for me to it became a metaphor that I sort of lived inside of and could understand my experience through. For much of my life, I have longed to belong, and I'm so grateful for so many aspects of my upbringing in that I got to see so much of the world at such a young age and in sort of deep, meaningful ways. We lived in Ethiopia, we lived in Uganda, Italy, England, spent lots of holidays in Ghana among my father's family, lived in Tanzania. But just as we were settling into a country and I was learning the language and making friends, then we had to get ready to leave. And, so there were times that I felt, as I kind of talk about in the passage I read, I felt like an outsider of my own family's. I didn't speak my father's language because I'm Black. When I was visiting my mother's family in the United States, some people assumed I was adopted. I'm an American citizen. I didn't live here until I was 18. And, the other places that I'm connected to through my family in terms of my cultures, I never lived in Ghana for a long period of time. I've never been to Armenia. I've never been to Turkey either, which is where my family moved to America from in order to escape genocide. And so I was always sort of an outsider, even in the places that I, should be able to, in so many ways, call home. And so, in some ways, this book was a way for me to write myself closer to belonging. I did a lot of research around the places where my family came from, their histories. I learned a lot through the writing of this book about the Ashanti Empire. My father's from the Ashanti tribe in Ghana. I also learned a lot about the Armenian Genocide, which was a history that sort of shaped my family's life, but that I didn't deeply understand in an embodied way. And so the book actually was a way for me to grapple with the different parts of my identity and to bring them together, to weave them together through this metaphor of an earthquake, and also to just narrate myself home in some ways, to a deeper sense of belonging to the places and cultures that I love.
I really like what you did about when you gave us your family histories. It's ironic, that the president just maybe this week or last week acknowledged the Armenian genocide.
Mhm.
And I don't think a lot of people even know about it, or they might not know deeply about it. The other thing that you wrote about your family history was when you wrote about, what happened in Ghana with Nkrumah, Kwame Nkrumah. Like, I think in our Black studies world, we think of him as this great big hero, right? And I did not realize that there were other sides to his reputation. You also did the same thing with the president of Tanzania. He did great work educating the people, but then it seems like his tenure ended. The country was really, really poor. Um, Seeing that these great men, I'm saying great men as in famous, um, they're put up on a pedestal by us. But in some ways, you put your dad up on a pedestal too. Did you notice that there was a correlation between how you handled their stories and how you handled your father's story?
Yeah, that's a great question. And absolutely. I think one of the things that I was exploring, and both Nkrumah and Nyerere, who was sort of the founder of what is now Tanzania, post-colonial Tanzania, both of them are great men. They are, and they deserve this place in history. And Nkrumah's work in terms of developing this Pan-African vision that would unite Black peoples across the diaspora, and working, for example, with civil rights leaders in the United States, and that cross-cultural collaboration is so meaningful and so important. And at the same time, I think that we do a disservice to ourselves when we're not able to learn from the complicated parts of that history too.
Mhm.
And so I think that's what you're getting at, is that we can both celebrate the meaningful contributions that important figures in history made, and also look at the ways that their legacies were incomplete, including some of their own failures, so that we can learn from them. And I think that that's one of the biggest lessons that I sort of learned through the writing of the book, and even reflecting on American history and the ways in which sometimes the history of Black peoples in America is sort of like the way that we learn it in school, often, at least in elementary schools, but is that, the civil rights movement happened and then racism is sort of over. And that does such a disservice to the movement, and is part of the reason why we're still dealing with so many injustices and inequities today. And like,
Mhm.
America in so many ways is a very ahistorical country. We don't like to address the difficult parts of our history.
Mhm.
And so it was really important to me as a Ghanaian, to both celebrate the contributions that this tiny nation, made to the
Mhm.
world, in terms of that Pan-African vision, and also to look at the ways that there's more work to do, and that we need to learn from that history in order to move forward and do better in the future. And then I think the connection that you're making too, in terms of my own father, is that I think we do that with people in our own lives, like our heroes. As I said, my father was the great hero in my life for so many reasons, and he remains the great hero of my life. But
Mhm.
actually, by making him sort of a deity rather than a man who sort of learned from his own mistakes and tried to teach me that is sort of how we should approach our lives, that we make mistakes and we learn from them and we grapple with the challenging parts, that actually I was doing him a disservice, by not sort of allowing him the fullness of his humanity. And so I think that, acknowledging those mistakes and the challenges doesn't take away from how wonderful a person was or their important contributions, but rather allows us to build on those contributions, moving forward into the future.
That's great. Also, when you wrote about your brother, Kwame, I actually thought your brother got shot. The writing was that
Yeah,
a thing
yeah.
you did on purpose?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you had a scenario where your brother got shot and there was even a funeral.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end you said, oh,
Yeah.
Kwame didn't die. So that it had my heart beating fast for you because you had gone through so much trauma already. And
Oh, sorry. I think I've lost sound.
no, you're
Can you hear
fine.
me? Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry. There was like a little glitch. But yeah, that was very intentional. I think what I wanted to convey is that is really what happens inside of Black people when we know that our loved ones are having these encounters with the police, like our minds do create those stories, and that is part of the terrorism. You know, the fear that your loved ones are not going to come home. That's a very real fear that we carry in our bodies. And that story that I put on the page was actually the story that my mind created when my brother called me and said, you know, I've been arrested, I'm in jail for a very minor sort of traffic infraction, mistaken identity. But I actually, you know, was terrified that he was not going to make it home alive. And those are the kinds of stories that so many Black mothers and sisters and daughters and aunties, you know, create in our minds all the time and live with that fear. And so I wanted to put that fear on the page so that, you know, people who haven't experienced it can see just how terrifying it is. And at the same time, to acknowledge the ways in which, for some people, that story becomes real. For too many people, that story becomes real. And so, yeah, I think especially sort of in this moment where we're still in the middle of a global pandemic confronting police violence against Black people, that it's really important for people to understand that the terror of that is not something that we can get away from, and that we're constantly sort of plagued by these stories.
And like on a similar note, so you were talking, I'm obviously speaking from a point of privilege because I'm white, but Marion also can probably speak to this. Like when the Hate U Give movie came out, I was working at another branch, and my boss, Diane, she's a Black woman. And there was that scene in the movie where they were sitting the kids down and talking about what to do when, you know, you get pulled over or whatever. And she said, yeah, that's a talk that you have. Like, you guys have the birds and the bees talk, and we have this talk. And I was like, God, that's so heavy. I never knew that. But there was also that part in the book where you were writing and you said, I think your father told you that Black women have to work twice as hard to get half as far. And that's also, and I feel so privileged saying it, but I'm like, that's something I never realized. Like, and I felt like it's hard enough being a white woman. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think interestingly, when I moved to the United States, you know, and I've been Black all my life, of course, but what that means in the different places that I've lived has been different, you know, and I think a big part of my coming of age was moving to America. I sound very American, but that's because I went to international schools and was taught by a lot of American teachers. But I didn't live here, you know, and I have a U.S. passport because my mother is American, but the American side of my family is white. And so, you know, I moved here at 18, and a huge part of my coming of age was coming to understand the racial arrangement in America and my place in it. And it was so quickly clear to me that race and racism sort of shape so much of American life, the way that all of our systems, whether that's where people get to live or where people get to go to school, are shaped by racist thinking. And, you know, going back to what we were talking about before, even when we got rid of those laws on the books, that thinking continued to be central to the American experience and the Black American experience in particular. And I don't think that I fully understood that before I came here. The story that I understood was that story that we learned in school, which was that, yes, of course, there's still some racism that plays out on the interpersonal level, but there was the civil rights movement, and that sort of changed everything. And of course, the civil rights movement is so important. And, you know, the rights and privileges that I have as a Black person who is American, but also is African, you know, is because Black Americans fought for those rights. And so I don't want to sort of not give that movement its due. But at the same time, I think what was interesting to me too in coming to this country, as well as sort of realizing the ways that people interpreted me, from professors acting surprised or extravagantly enthusiastic when I did well in class, you know, which is very shocking to me, you know. And then, as we were talking about, when my younger brother moved here, it became even more jarring, because for me as a Black woman, I don't think that white people necessarily found me particularly threatening in the same way that they did my brother, who is sort of a large Black man. And so seeing the country through his eyes, and he moved to the United States at the height of the stop and frisk policy in New York, and so was constantly getting stopped by police, for nothing, for trying to go into his own building, for asking for directions, for minor traffic issues, and so that was an awakening for me. And I connected it to these moments that you're talking about, that actually I was reflecting on the ways that across the Black diaspora, we're united by this notion that Black people, whether you're in Africa, whether you're in Europe, whether you're in America, that you have to work twice as hard to get half as far. And that parents in all of those places, parents of Black children tell their children that, in the Caribbean, and so there are things that sort of link us. And, people think in terms of Africa, you would think that, these are countries that are run by Black people that are, of course, vastly majority Black, but at the same time, they're still operating within a white supremacist global capitalist economy that makes it so that that you still are encountering that racism, whether or not you're encountering it in your day-to-day lives, just in terms of what opportunities are available to you. And, for my father, he was able to come and get a very wonderful college education and master's education in the United States. And part of his being able to come here was that his parents actually said the same thing to him. You have to work twice as hard to get, coming from Ghana and going to the United States, you're going to have to, really work harder than anyone else. And so he sort of imparted that on me too. And I think that speech, similar to the speech that parents give to their young Black sons, is very common across the Black diaspora.
Speaking of your dad and working for the UN, you guys kind of lived in little enclaves where terrible wars were going on outside. In Ethiopia, I guess it was the Eritrean Civil War, and also in Tanzania. You lived so many places. I know there were two different places that civil war was going on, and you guys were inside of your compound behind a wall with barbed wire, and you talked about things like watching Melrose Place. It was really like American young girl things that you did while you were in the midst of all this stuff. Do you ever look back on those times and go, wow, like I was oblivious? Or is it like most people, just this is how I grew up?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think that my experience is I thought that it was important to both reckon with the ways that I have experienced oppression, in some of the ways that we've been talking about, but also the ways that I have experienced great privilege. And I think in America, sometimes the conversation about privilege turns into something like, well, I've worked so hard, so how can you say that I'm, like experiencing privilege? And those things are not mutually exclusive. You can both suffer from oppression and also experience privilege. And I thought it was important for me to acknowledge the ways in which I was privileged, including in the ways that you're talking about, which is that when we lived in Ethiopia, when we lived in Uganda, that we're experiencing civil war, that we lived in UN compounds, were very much protected, had access to imported foods, whereas there was great suffering all around us. I was very aware of it, though, even as a young child. And I think that's in a way that I don't know that all UN families are. And particularly, because my family was Black. And so, and my father was African. And so when we lived in Ethiopia, when we lived in Uganda, it was really important to my father that I understood the history that was being made all around me, because he knew that in the international schools that I attended, I was not going to learn that history. Even when we were living in the middle of the civil war in Ethiopia, when I went to my international school, which was largely an American system, some British system schools that I attended, we were going to learn European history, even though we were sort of in the midst of this history being made all around us. And so my father sort of made it his job as an African man who was in the UN and sort of a higher ranking official in the UN, that it was really important to him that I understood the history that was being made all around me. And he was very much engaged with and always telling us about how the conflicts we were living in the midst of were tied to older conflicts, colonialism and empire, and how those violences are connected. And so those questions and those issues have always been part of my consciousness. It was sort of how I was raised. But then as an adult, I felt like it was really important for me to understand those histories in a deeper way, in part to sort of to give their due to the people in those places who welcomed us, who accepted us into their communities and cultures, and so I wanted to spend even more time as an adult doing a deeper dive into the histories of those conflicts and countries. And so that's sort of what that's part of what this book was about as well, was sort of reconnecting to the places that were my home and working to understand those histories in a deeper sense.
Thank you.
I wanted to talk a little bit about mental illness with you. So like I've struggled with depression my whole life. And your writing, I felt, about mental illness is just so raw and visceral and genuine. And a lot of times when you read memoirs or personal essays from people who have experienced emotional turmoil, it's very heavy-handed and it's almost performative. So it was really refreshing that it was so honest, and a lot of it, like, I feel like, whoa, like we had the same experience almost. That was great. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the blue chair. That really struck me, particularly because I literally have a huge blue chair in my apartment that I sink into when I'm feeling low. So that was especially relatable. But you return to that blue chair throughout the book. But that first chapter titled "The Blue Chair," when you start to describe, like, let's say you're doing this and you feel this way, in particular, that was so earnest. Can you talk a little bit about the symbolism of that blue chair and how you came to it and kept returning to it in the book?
Sure. Thank you so much for saying that, first of all. I mean, I think it was really important to me to write about my depression and anxiety and mental illness from inside of what it felt like, in my body, and in the hopes that it would connect to other people who struggle in similar ways. And so it means a lot to hear that it did for you. And so yeah, I think as I was talking about, a lot of the sort of histories and the traumas that I carry in my body, whether it's sort of the intergenerational trauma of the Armenian Genocide, which actually studies have shown that it gets passed down through our DNA, that trauma. Also the sort of the trauma of abandonment, my mother leaving when I was 2, the trauma of my father dying, and then sort of adding to that the ways in which, as Black women, we are often taught that we have to be strong, that mental illness is actually, that's for white people. You don't have time to like feel your emotions in that way, and you have to work twice as hard, And so I think for me, even though I sort of was struggling with depression and anxiety for a very long time, I sort of thought that, and I don't think this is unique to Black people, I think that this is true for a lot of people, but there is a kind of specificity of the Black experience that I was also writing into. But I think that I tried for a really long time to just keep plowing forward and to not sort of confront the reality that I was really struggling. And I think that we increasingly are coming to understand now that doesn't work, and that it will catch up with you. And in my case, it caught up with me when I was living in New York. I had sort of tried to get on with my life and sort of move forward without really feeling the full grief of losing my father and being estranged from my mother, and all of sort of the violence and war that we witnessed. And then I also was at the World Trade Center on 9/11, and so confronting all of those both kind of seismic and global traumas, which I think we're living through another one right now. And I think it's going to be so important for us to reflect on how we acknowledge our collective grief and trauma in this moment and move forward. But I hadn't allowed myself to do that. And so I found myself at the age of 28, sort of sitting in this blue chair in my room that I had dragged in off the street, because I think subconsciously I knew that, madness was coming and I was going to have to confront, all of these traumas. And I found myself sort of sitting in that blue chair, largely not getting out of it very much at all for 7 days, and sort of reckoning with all of this grief and trauma and trying to make meaning and make sense of it, and struggling to find steady ground even in my own sense of self, and being tormented by these signals in my body, and I connect them to a seismometer, which is what we use to measure earthquakes, sort of warning me, that I needed to sort of confront the disasters of my life. And so that's really what the blue chair was about for me. It was a moment of sort of final acknowledgement that, I had tried to escape these traumas, but that trauma is carried in the body, and that you can only run so far from it before it catches up with you. And so those sections in the book, from which I'm narrating them from inside of the blue chair, inside of the breakdown, and I am comfortable saying that it was a breakdown. I had a mental breakdown, and really allowed myself to fully feel that. And so sitting in that blue chair, and those sections are each of the 7 days of that breakdown are sort of narrated and spread throughout the book, and sort of are a thread that connects the different strands of my life, because in the blue chair, I was really trying to make meaning of those histories and the stories of my life.
You know I want to commend you on the lyrical writing of the book, and I tried to find your chapbook. Unfortunately, the time ran out and I wasn't able to get it. Were you ever a poet? Because the writing is so lyrical.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much. I do write poetry. And my chapbook is sort of a lyric essay, and is very much, when I think of lyric essay, I do think that it is very much connected to poetry. And it's sort of a narrative poem, sort of moving forward. But the attention to language, I think, sometimes when other writers ask, how do you move forward when you feel stuck or you're not sure what's going to happen in the narrative, or in the case of memoir, often we're writing about traumatic events, and so there's resistance in the body, and sort of how do you sort of find your way through that. And as a reader of poetry and somebody who has come to love language through poetry, I find that one thing that sort of allows me to keep writing, whatever the block is attention to language. And if I can pay attention to the rhythm of the sentences and to my word choice, that keeps me sort of moving forward in the writing, even if I don't know sort of where it's going, that sentence by sentence, I can sort of move myself forward in the narrative.
There was one sentence that says something like, you know how when you're too hot and you take off your big heavy wool coat, and then you're so disappointed to find out you still have on a big heavy wool sweater. And I just thought, wow, that is so much like life, right? Like if I could just get this one thing off my back, I'll feel better. And then you look down. I mean, I can't even say it. Go ahead.
Yeah.
I can't say it the way you said it, but I got the idea immediately.
Oh, thanks.
But now that you finish your memoir, or part one of your memoir, I know this has occurred to you. Where do you go now? Do you write another one, or because I know Rory can agree with this. I kept thinking you and your mom were going to meet up in New York, and y'all were just going to become BFFs. And I guess I can ask, did that happen for you?
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, the book sort of leaves off, and a memoir, of course, is not an autobiography. You're not sort of writing it at the end of your life. So the story is ongoing. A memoir is like a story about a particular period in your life, and explores specific themes during that period, whereas an autobiography sort of generally is about an important person reflecting on their whole life from beginning to end. And so I think you're exactly right that the book sort of leaves off in a moment of potential and possibility in terms of my relationship with my mother. And I'll say that part of the writing of the book, I actually started writing the book as a private project, and I
Oh.
didn't in the beginning know that I was going to publish it. I was sort of working on a novel, and I thought that's what I would put out in the world. And I was really working on this project for myself as a way to kind of narrate myself to closer connection. I was coming out of that period of deep depression, and I had this feeling that I really needed to make meaning and make sense of the events of my life in order to move forward into the world with new possibilities for how I could exist in community with other people. And that included with my mother. I think I was sort of writing towards deeper connection and the possibility of reconciliation with my mother through understanding her experience as somebody who descended from genocide survivors and growing up in a community that had experienced such trauma. And I think the writing of the book actually allowed me to understand her experience in such a way that I could be open to forgiveness and to reconciliation. And so the end of the book, I do sort of connect with her tentatively, and sort of make those steps towards reconciliation. And it has been now a decade since the sort of the writing of the book and where the book ends. I didn't finish writing the book a decade ago. I sort of like created a lot of the raw material for it, and then set it aside for a while, was focusing on other projects, and then came back to it. But yeah, I do have a good relationship with my mother now. And I think because of all of the work that I had done with the book to kind of narrate myself towards compassion and curiosity about her experience, and being able to ask her sort of, what were you going through? And that doesn't mean that I wasn't hurt, that I don't still carry the hurt and trauma from not having her in my life. But I think as an adult, and having gone through what I went through with my own mental health struggles, I think I was able to better understand her choices, and especially sort of doing the research on the history of the community that she came from, and just how much trauma they experience, having to leave their home and coming to a new place with really nothing, to start over, not speaking the language. And so, yeah, we have been really honest. We've been engaged in like a lot of really honest conversations about our lives and our experiences. And she actually is one of the biggest champions of this book, in this story, and has been sort of driving around Massachusetts where she lives and taking photos of it in bookstores. And so that has been really lovely too. The fact that this book actually was a way for me to find my way back to her, and for us to connect in deeper ways.
Just wanted to chime in. If anyone has questions for Nadia, we're starting to approach the 15-minute mark towards the end of the hour, so please be sure to get them in. We have one, but just waiting for a couple minutes to ask it. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about mother-daughter relationships, because I have a very, I feel like now my mom is my best friend, but and obviously, well, my mom didn't leave, but there were times growing up that we really butted heads. So I'm always, and I like writing, but I'm always thinking, my mom's always like, why don't you write something? Why don't you write a memoir? And it's like, I can't write a memoir until you're dead, because you're gonna kill me. But you wrote about your biological mother and also your stepmother. And you even acknowledged in certain portions of the book that your father in many ways was your mother. And that you took maternal roles with your siblings a lot of the time, but you also wrote you're not ready to be a mom yourself, and you weren't sure if you would ever be ready. So how did your experiences with these two mothers and even your father affect your own impressions of motherhood? And has that evolved? Have you changed your mind about motherhood for yourself?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for me, in terms of motherhood, that's still an open question. But one of the things, my brother Kwame actually has a child now, my first nephew, Kwesi, and Kwame moved back to Ghana. So unfortunately, I love that he has moved back to Ghana and is getting in touch with my father's family, because my brother didn't grow up. My brother was so young when my father passed, and so him getting to spend time with my father's side of the family has been so wonderful. And raising his son in Ghana, I think, is really meaningful to him. And I adore my nephew, and so I'm very much looking forward. He's just 2 years old, and I went to visit him shortly after he was born, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing him again. And thinking about that role now, being an auntie, I was also realizing the ways in which I was also raised. A story I could tell is that I grew up without a mother, but it's also true that I was raised by many mothers. And my aunties, my father's sisters, were such maternal figures in my life, especially my auntie Harriet, who I'm still so close to, and sort of stepped up. After my mother left, she took my sister and I in while my father sort of figured out how to set up his life as a single father, and so we lived for a couple of years with her in the UK, and so reflecting on motherhood and the ways that people mother, it's not only a role for a biological mother. That I actually was so fortunate to have so many mothers and maternal figures in my life. And I think because of the conventional story that we're told, that a family is two parents and you raise the kids in a nuclear family, the reality is that Ghanaian culture, Ashanti culture, is not set up that way. Like, we actually are raised in extended families, and aunties are mothers, and uncles are fathers, and grandmothers are mothers, and our cousins are our brothers and sisters. And so part of what I discovered in the writing of this book too was that I actually don't have to internalize that story, that there's only kind of one family that is legitimate. And that doesn't take away from, again, the sort of grief I felt at not having my biological mother around. But it also allowed me to be so grateful for all of the wonderful maternal figures, including my father, who was a single father and, what did a lot of mothering of, if you think of mothering as a verb, of my sister and I, like, did our hair in the morning, like had these two little black girls and was doing the little pom-pom hairstyles and braids. And so I found a lot of sort of gratitude for that, and then was thinking about, like, in what ways can I play a maternal role in my siblings' lives and in my nephew's life, while I sort of grapple with what motherhood means for me in a broader sense, but yeah, that was like a really beautiful part of the book for me, was reminding myself of just how many people reached out to love my sister and me, despite sort of our mother leaving, that we had so many people in our lives who were there for us and who cared for us deeply.
Do you talk to Annabelle?
I do. Yeah, my stepmother is in my life. She's my brother's mother. We have a complicated relationship, as I do with my birth mother. We're working through it, and I leave possibilities open for what our relationship can be like in the future. I think it's really important, and it was really important to me in the book, to acknowledge the ways in which she was, there. I certainly talk about the difficult parts of our relationship, but at the end of the day, she was willing to take in two teenage girls, after experiencing the loss of her husband. And she was a woman who moved into her husband's house from her father's house very young, did not go into the workforce, and then found herself widowed at a young age, sort of trying to figure out how to be a woman in the world on her own, with 3 children at that point. And so was also able to sort of extend a lot of compassion for the trauma and grief that she went through as well.
Did she read the book? I'm curious how she reacted to, because I mean, you did mention a lot of the really rough stuff. I think you had a lot of empathy for her, and also, circled back a lot of times and said, like, I realized that this is not what she really meant. Like, she was going through stuff herself. But I'm like trying to imagine writing that book and how people would react to it.
Yeah, I didn't really think about that much. For me, it was more important to tell my truth as fully as possible. And that meant extending, I held a principle of like, I'm writing towards love and connection, but it's really important to me to also be honest.
Yeah.
And that means sort of being hard on myself in the places where I was wrong and did harm, and being open and honest about the ways that I felt harm from others as well. And as long as I was doing that as honestly as possible, that's what was important to me. And, I published a lot of the chapters of the book along the way, so nothing was new to anyone in my family. We've had these conversations, there's nothing in it that would have been shocking to them, through the conversations that we've had, because I approached the process as an opportunity to be honest and to open up dialogue in a more meaningful way, so that we could figure out if there were ways to move forward and to show up for each other differently and be in different kinds of relationship with each other. And like, I actually found that honesty actually helped us to grapple with some of the difficult parts of our lives. And whether or not she's read the whole book, I don't know, but certainly she has read pieces of it, and we've had conversations over the years, so nothing would have been surprising to her or to anyone else in my life.
I love the libations at the end.
Oh, yeah.
I thought that was your saying, I forgive you.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that pouring the libations was saying, I forgive you. And you named all the people one by one. I'm curious to know, it seems like Annabelle tried to have, well, she came from a Christian Orthodox church, right?
That's my mother. Annabelle was raised in the Lutheran church. Yeah, so many different denominations.
So many different denominations, yeah. Right? Yeah. But it seems like they had faith. It seems like your father was the one that said, let's just use wisdom. Mm-hmm. How far have you moved towards either their brand of faith, or have you been able to hold tight to your father's idea?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I have so much. I think what I found through the writing of the book was how open I am to understand people's different connections to faith and to the idea that there are things that are greater than us in the universe, right. And like to have a lot of curiosity about those things, which I think for some parts of my life I was sort of closed to. Mm-hmm. And I don't think actually that's what my father intended. Like when I looked at the lessons that he gave me, it was, to allow myself to feel a sense of openness, but to also question the parts of faith stories that do harm to people, and to acknowledge the ways that, religion, not necessarily faith, but religion, organized religion, has been used in sort of projects of colonization, and that sort of history, that it was important to sort of wrestle with those things too. And so I think in my life, I probably am closer to my father in terms of my own belief system, which is that certainly there are things that are greater than us in the world that are miraculous, and whether that's sort of science or mysticism, that I have an openness to sort of to all of those possibilities. I think there's so much that we don't know. I'm not somebody who sort of attends church or is part of an organized religion. And yet at the same time, I think through the writing of this book and realizing the ways that I had my own practices of faith, whether I called it religion or not, allowed me to have a deeper sense of respect and openness to people who do practice religion and faith, and particularly those whose faith drives them to be kinder, warmer, more open, generous people in the world, which is a lot of, there are a lot of people for whom their faith sort of gives them lessons for how to approach the world with more kindness and openness. And I think however people get there, that is valid and important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That was a great answer.
Sorry, Marion. We do have one question from the audience, and this came in all the way back during your reading. It says, I was fortunate while a student in Soviet Union in 1986 to have spent time in Soviet Armenia, a remarkable and resilient people. I had a great friend and comrades from Yerevan. As you speak about food, I so miss it. Can you recommend your favorite Armenian restaurant in Brooklyn?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that many Armenian restaurants in Brooklyn, and usually when I like really kind of go into Armenian food is when I go and visit my mother in Watertown, Massachusetts, which of course has a very large Armenian population and lots of wonderful places. Plus my family are, make amazing Armenian food. But I do know that there is an Armenian cafe in Coney Island, which I think is called High, if I'm not mistaken, cafe. But yeah, it's in Coney Island, and it's very good.
Wow.
Sorry, I'm like tracking things here. You sort of touched upon this a little bit, but the metaphorical use of earthquakes frames your entire narrative, and it pops up a lot in relation to trauma, both personal trauma and historically, when you narrate your family's history. And you kind of touch upon it in the book, but I'm assuming not everyone's read that. So have you felt this inside of you your whole life, or what was your first encounter with identifying that metaphor about the earthquakes?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. Yeah, so I think, going back to the kind of story that I told at the beginning of this session, the fact that my mother arrived on the same day as this catastrophic earthquake in Armenia in the 80s, that's sort of what sort of opened up this earthquake metaphor for me that I lived in. And I realized, I didn't realize how much I think in seismic terms until, as I said, I started writing this book as a private project. But at a certain point, I realized, okay, maybe I can make art out of this. And so I went in and started revising it, thinking about sort of how do I turn this into a work of art that I would share with readers. And I sent it to a mentor and dear friend of mine in kind of an earlier draft to see what she thought. And one of the things that she said to me was like, you realize that you write a lot about earthquakes, and you're using like a lot of seismic terms, and the metaphor is very much in the manuscript. And so can you even be more intentional about that? And the truth was that I hadn't realized that I was doing it. It was just, it happened very naturally, I think, because of that story, I think all of us have these memories from our childhood that are so clear and that sort of become a key part of our origin story and how we think about who we are in the world. And that was one for me. And so once she said that, I was like, oh, yes, I am writing a lot about earthquakes and these seismic terms. And then I think what I realized was that, I was struggling to figure out what is the structure of this story. And particularly because I grew up moving around so much, living in so many different countries, that I'm from so many cultures. And one of my concerns was, are people going to get confused? Like, what are some threads that I can give people to hold on to that will carry them through this nonlinear narrative? And one of the kind of linear pieces of the book is the blue chair, as we were talking about before. But when my mentor told me, about the earthquake metaphor, I was like, oh, earthquakes have been a sort of guiding metaphor for my life. And the story of an earthquake is not linear. We don't usually we can't understand the story of an earthquake except in retrospect, because what we thought was the earthquake turns out it was actually a foreshock, and then we have to reshuffle the story of an earthquake. And that's sort of how I felt about my life story. I had to constantly reshuffle and make meaning and make sense and make these connections between these places, Ghana and Armenia. How are they connected? And how do I tie the histories of my family through my body? And the thing about aftershocks too is that we never know when they're going to happen or how long they'll last. And that's also true of how we experience trauma. I think we never know when it's going to come back and sort of hit us in the gut. And so that also made a lot of sense to me, to kind of think about it in those terms then. And so the book is written thematically with the stages of an earthquake in seismic terms, linking the threads. And this ended up being the way that made the most sense for me to write about my life. And then also I'll say, in many African cultures, including the Ashanti culture that my father is from, time is not a straight line. It's circular, and there are circles within circles. And when we move in and out of them, and, people make jokes about colored people time, but I think that's really what it comes from, is that we experience time differently. And so like being late, if you're like deeply engaged with your community, and that being late is not the worst thing in the world. Like, we don't think about things in linear terms. Like, you go here and then the next step is you go there. And so I was trying to capture some of that as well, that the past and present coexist, and in the Ashanti culture in particular, we believe that our ancestors are actually with us, all the time, kind of interfering in our lives, giving advice and wisdom. And so I wanted to sort of honor that tradition as well, and to provide some anchors and posts at the same time for readers to hold on to.
So who did you have anything to do with the cover art, or was that chosen by your publisher?
So they actually, it was wonderful because they did engage me in the process, and sort of there were many different versions, and it was really fun to kind of look at the different colors and fonts, and there were some dramatically different options that were shared as well, but it was a very collaborative process.
Yeah. It's lovely.
It's
lovely. I mean, if you just walked by the book and it was facing out, it would really strike your attention. Like, oh, what's that about?
Yeah, thank you. And I love how they played with kind of the kente. Kente is sort of one of the traditional cloths of the Ashanti, and they kind of played with that. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, it's beautiful.
I think it's like the UK version, or a different version has like childhood photos on the cover.
Oh.
Yeah, it was fun to see how the story was interpreted by different designers, and I love the UK cover too. It's very different, but I think both covers kind of capture different elements of the story. So it was very fun to see how designers, and I'm not necessarily a visual person, so it was very fun to see how more visual thinkers kind of created the story through these images.
It's beautiful.
This is it's such a beautifully written, like masterfully written book. It came out on my birthday. I was really excited about it. Like, I saw, I read in the New York Times, it was like one of the most anticipated books this year, which must be so exciting for you. But I like couldn't wait for it. I'm like, oh yeah, it comes out on my birthday. Like, this is meant to be. And usually stuff like that just ends up being a disappointment, but this was so great. Like, it really is so beautiful.
Thank you so much. That's so kind.
It's so rich. It's so rich. It's not only a memoir, it's a lot of history lessons. And I love your odes to Toni Morrison.
Yes.
And there was another writer too that I can't remember now who it was, but I remember you talked about the character Pilot from it was The Bluest Eye as well.
Yeah.
I love your odes to the older writers. It was just rich. You had international history.
Yeah.
You had literary background. You had life in New York, that whole passage about 9/11. Like, who would have thought? Who would have thought that after all the places that you lived, that you would be in the financial district on the day of 9/11? It's up. When I read that, I actually got scared for you. I actually said, oh my God, how is she going to go on now?
You've really been through it. Like,
you've really been through it.
It's really, like, you're very resilient. It's cool that, you've been through all this and you're able to sit with us and talk, and have it together.
Right. That's exactly what I meant. I mean, I think a weaker person could have been someplace else, locked away, or, but wow, and to go through what you've gone through and then to be in the city that day and witness what you witnessed. God bless you. God bless you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that's so kind, such lovely, thoughtful reaction to the book, and it means a lot to me. And I think, what I hope is that others, I think there's so many people who have gone through so much and have struggled with mental health issues and trauma and have lived through disasters and of all kinds, both private disasters and sort of like man-made disasters and seismic disasters, and especially, having this book come out during a moment of collective grief and trauma, with the global pandemic as well, and the ongoing sort of uprisings for racial justice. it has been so important to me to say that we can go through this, and as long as we sort of figure out how to make meaning of it, how to move ourselves towards community and connection, which I think is the reason, for me, that I have been able to come out of it, and that has sustained me, like the deep love and connection I have for my family and my communities, that actually has been what has gotten me through. And then also thinking about community really expansively, and coming to America, for example, and being so welcomed by the Black American community in so many ways. And I feel such a strong sort of kinship and sense of responsibility that drives me to continue to organize for racial justice in this country too. And so thinking about community really expansively and how we're all so deeply connected, that was sort of one of the biggest takeaways for me in the writing of the book. And, like many writers, I write to know what I think and to understand and make meaning of the world. And so I hope that others who have gone through a lot too can find that sense of possibility in community and connection and love that I found as I was sort of recounting my experiences.
That's terrific. All right, so I'm just gonna wrap it up. It's been so great having you here. Aftershocks, for anyone who's interested, is available here at the library for curbside pickup. You can contact your local branch or search our online catalog to reserve a copy. We also really recommend you go out and buy this one because it's really worth the money. It's
really
terrific.
Yes.
Book Sandwiched In is made possible by gifts to the New Haven Free Public Library Foundation. If you enjoyed this program, please consider making a donation at NHFPL/donate to help support our collections, our programs, and our services throughout the year. And just a couple notes, just feel free to join us next week. We're going to be welcoming Mark L. Levine to discuss his book, The Trial of the Chicago Seven, the official transcript, which is pretty timely after the Oscars just happened. We also have a slightly older session of Book Sandwiched In airing on C-SPAN this Saturday, which is my co-coordinator here, Isaac Shub. Well, he's talking to Professor Frank Snowden about the book Epidemics in Society. So that will be at 1 p.m. Eastern time on Saturday. If you guys have cable at home, please check it out. It was a really good one. Thank you again so much, Nadia, for being here with us. This was a great chat, and I really enjoyed reading your book. I'm definitely going to read it again. Marion, if you had anything else to...
No, I was going to say thank you. Thank you, Nadia.
Thank you so
much. Yes.
Thanks for having me.